Hinds and High Places, Chapter 15. The path they followed did not go straight up to the heights, but sloped gently up the mountainside. The mist still shrouded everything, and indeed grew a little thicker. All three walked in silence, occupied with different thoughts. Much afraid was thinking of the promise the shepherd so recently had given her. Behold, I come quickly, and will give thee thy heart's desire. Suffering and sorrow perhaps were thinking of the answer they had received on the question asked of him at parting. Whether or not this was so, there was no indication, for they walked in complete silence, though the help they gave their lame companion was, had she noticed it, even more gentle and untiring than before. Toward evening they came to another log cabin, standing on the side of the path with the shepherd with the shepherd's secret marked inscribed upon the door, so that they knew they were to rest there for the night. Once again they noticed that someone must have been there quite recently, for a fire was burning brightly on the hearth, and a kettle of water was singing on the hob. The table, too, was laid for three, and a supply of bread and fruit upon it. Evidently their arrival had been expected, and these kindly preparations made, but of the one who had thus gone in the way before them there was no sign. They washed themselves and then sat down at the table, gave thanks, and ate of the prepared meal. Then, being weary, they lay down to rest and immediately fell asleep. How long she had slept, Much Afraid could not tell, but she woke suddenly while it was still quite dark. Her companion slumbered peacefully beside her, but she knew that someone had called her. She waited in silence. Then a voice said, Much Afraid, behold me, here I am, my lord, she answered. Much Afraid, said the voice, take now the promise you received when I called you to follow me to the high places, and take the natural longing for human love which you have found already growing in your heart when I planted my own love there, and go up into the mountain where the to the place that I shall show you. Offer them there as a burnt offering unto me. There was a long silence before Much Afraid's trembling voice spoke through the darkness. My lord, am I understanding you right? Yes, answered the voice. Come now to the entrance of the hut, and I will show you where you are to go. Without waking the two beside her, she rose silently, opened the door of the hut, and stepped outside. Everything was still shrouded in mist, and the mountains were completely invisible, swallowed up in darkness and cloud. As she looked, the mist parted in one place, and a little window appeared through which the moon and one star shone brightly. Just below them was a white peak, glimmering palely. At its foot was the rocky ledge over which the great waterfall leaped and reached down toward the slopes below. Only the lip of rock over which it poured itself was visible, and all below being shrouded in the mist. Then came the voice. Then this is the appointed place. Much Afraid looked and replied, Yes, Lord. Behold me, I am thy handmaiden. I will do according to thy will. She did not lie down again, but stood at the door of the hut, waiting for daybreak. It seemed to her that filled the voice of the fall now filled the whole night, and was thundering through her trembling heart, reverberating and shouting through every part, and repeating again and again, Take now the promise that I gave you, and the natural human love in your heart, and offer them for a burnt offering. With the first glimmer of dawn, she bent over her sleeping companions and said, "We must start at once. I have received commandment to go up to the place where the great fall pours itself over the precipice." They rose immediately, and after hurriedly eating a meal to strengthen themselves, they started on their way. The path led straight up the mountainside toward the thunderous voice of the fall. Though everything was still shrouded in mist and cloud, and the fall itself remained invisible. As the hours passed, they continued to climb, though the path was now steeper than ever before. In the distance, thunder began to roll, and flashes of lightning rent the veil of mist. Suddenly, higher up on the path, they heard the sound of running feet, running feet slipping and scraping on the rocks and stones. They stopped and pressed themselves closely to one side of the narrow path to allow the runners to pass. Then ran then out of the ghostly mist appeared first fear, then bitterness, followed by resentment, pride, and self-pity. They were running as though for their lives, and as they reached the three women, they shouted, "Back! Turn back at once! The avalanches are falling ahead, and the whole mountainside is shaking as though it will fall too. Run for your lives!" Without waiting for an answer, they clattered roughly past and fled down the mountainside. "What are we to do?" asked Suffering and Sorrow, apparently at a loss for the very first time. "Shall we turn back to the hut and wait until the avalanches and the storm are over?" "No," said Much Afraid in a low, steady voice, speaking for the first time since she had called them out to rise and follow her. "No, we must not turn back. I have received a commandment to go up to the place where the great fall pours over the rock." Then the voice spoke close at hand. "There is a place I prepared for you here beside the path. Wait there until the storm is over." In the rock, in the rocky wall beside them was a little cave so low that it could be entered only if they stooped right down, and with just enough room for them to crouch inside. Side by side, they sat huddled together. Then all of a sudden the storm burst over them in a frightful fury. The mountains reverberated with thunder and with the sound of falling rocks and the great avalanches. The lightning flashed incessantly and ran along the ground in sizzling flames. Then the rains descended and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon the mountains until everything around them seemed to be shivering and quaking and falling. Flood waters rushed down the steep cliffs, and the torrent poured over the rocks which projected over the cave, so the whole entrance was closed with a waterfall. But not a single drop fell inside the cave where the three sat together on the ground. After they had been there for some time, and the storm, far from abating, seemed to be increasing in strength, much afraid, silently put her hand in her bosom and drew out the leather bag which she always carried. Emptying the little heap of stones and pebbles onto her lap, she looked at them. They were the memorial stones from all the altars which she had built along the way, from the time that she stood beside the shepherd at the pool and allowed him to plant the thorn in her heart, and all along the journey until that moment of crouching in a narrow cave upon which the whole mountain seemed to be ready to topple. Nothing was left to her. Nothing was left to her but a command to offer up the promise on which she had staked her all, on the strength of which she had started on the journey. She stood at the little pile. She looked at the little pile in her lap and asked herself dully, "Shall I throw them away, Were they not all worthless promises which he gave me on the way here? Then with icy fingers she picked up the first stone and repeated the first words that he had spoken to her beside the pool. I will make thy feet like hinds' feet, and set thee upon thine high places. She held the stone in her hand for a long time, then said slowly, I have not received hinds' feet, but I am on higher places than I ever imagined possible, and if I die up here, what does it matter? I will not throw it away. She put the stone back in the bag, picked up the next, and repeated, What I do thou know, what I do thou, what I do thou knowest not now, but thou shalt have, but thou shalt know hereafter. And she gave a little sob and said, Half at least of that is true, and who knows whether the other half is true or not, but I will not throw it away. Picking up the third stone, she quoted, This is not unto death, but for the glory of God. Not unto death, she repeated, even though he says, offer the promise as a burnt offering. But she dropped the stone back into the bag and took up the fourth. Bread corn is bruised, but no one crushes it forever. I cannot part with that, she said, replaced it in the bag, and took the fifth. Cannot I do cannot I do with you as the potter, saith the Lord? Yes, said she, and put it back into the bag. Taking the sixth, she repeated, O thou afflicted, tossed with tempest, and not comforted, behold, I will lay thy stones with fair colors. Then could go no further, but wept bitterly. How could I part with that? She said. She asked herself, and she put it in the bag with the others, and took the seventh. My sheep hear my voice, and they follow me. Shall I not throw this one away? She asked herself. Have I really heard his voice, or have I been deceiving myself all the time? Then, as she thought of his face when he gave her the promise, she replaced it in the bag, saying, I will keep it. How can I let it go? And she took the eighth. Now shalt thou see what I will do. Remembering the precipice which had seemed so terribly impossible, and how he had brought her to the top, she put the stone with the others and took the ninth. God is not a man that he should lie. Hath he said, and shall he not do it? Or hath he spoken, and shall he not make it good? For a very long time she sat trembling with that stone in her hand, but in the end she said, I have already given the only answer possible when I told him, If thou canst, thou mayest deceive me. Then she dropped the icy cold little pebble into the bag and took the tenth. Thine ears shall hear a word behind thee saying, This is the way, walk ye in it, where ye turn to the right hand and where ye turn to the left. At that she shuddered, but after a while added, Thou hast a little strength, and hast not denied my name. Hold that fast which thou hast, that no man take thy crown. Returning the tenth stone to the bag, after a long pause, she picked up an ugly little stone lying on the floor of the cave and dropped it beneath up in beside the other 10, saying, Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. Tying up the bag again, she said, Though everything in the world should tell me they are worthless, yet I cannot part with them. and put the bag once again in her bosom. Sorrow and her sister had been sitting silently beside her, watching intently as she went over the little heap of stones in her lap. Both gave a strange laugh, as though of relief and thankfulness, and said together, "The rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon the house, and it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock." But this time the rain had ceased. By this time the rain had ceased. The cataract was no longer pouring over the rocks, and only a light mist remained. The rolling of the thunder and the roar of the avalanches were were fading away over into the distance as they looked out of the cave. Up from the depths beneath them came th- the depths beneath came the wreaths of mist and clear jubilant voices of a bird. It might have been brother to that which sang in the dripping woods at the foot of the high places. He's gotten his victory, hurrah! He's gotten his victory, hurrah! As the pure, clear notes came floating up to them, the icy cloud, the icy coldness of the heart of Much Afraid broke, then melted away. She pressed her hands convulsively against the little bag of stones, as though it contained priceless treasure which she had thought lost, and said to her companions, "The storm is over. Now we can go on our way." From that place on, it was very steep going, for the path now went straight up the mountainside, so straight and steep that often Much Afraid could hardly do more than crawl forward on hands and knees. All along she had hoped that the higher she went and the nearer she got to the high places, the stronger she would become, and the less she would stumble. But it was quite otherwise. The higher they went, the more conscious she was that her strength was leaving her, and the weaker she grew. The more the more she stumbled. She could not help dimly realize that this was not the case with her companions. The higher they went, the more vigorous and strong they seemed to become, and this was good because often they had to almost carry Much Afraid, for she seemed utterly spent and exhausted. Because of this, they made very slow progress indeed. On the second day, they came to a place where a little hollow in the mountainside formed a tiny plateau. Here a spring bubbled out of the cliff and trickled across the hollow and down through the side of the mountain in a little waterfall. As they paused to rest, the voice said to Much Afraid, "Drink of the brook at the side of the way and be strengthened." Stooping down at the spring where it bubbled up from between the rocks, she filled her mouth with the water, and as soon as she swallowed it, she found it was so burning and bitter that her stomach rejected it altogether and she was unable to retain it. She knelt by the spring, gasping for a moment, and then said very quietly and softly through the silence, "My lord, it is not that I will not, but that I cannot drink of this cup." "There is a tree growing beside the spring of Marah," answered the voice. "Break off a piece of branch, and when you have cast it into the waters, they will be sweetened." Much Afraid looked at the other side of the spring and saw a little stunted thorn tree with but one branch growing on either side of the splintered trunk, like the arms of a cross. They were covered all over with long, sharp spines. Suffering stepped forward, broke off a piece of the thorn tree, and brought it to Much Afraid, who took it from her hand and cast it into the water. On doing this, she stooped her head again to drink. This time she found that the stinging, burning bitterness was gone, and though the water was still not sweet, she could drink it easily. She drank thirstily and found it must have contained curative properties, for almost at once she was wonderfully refreshed and strengthened. Then she picked up her 12th and last stone there beside the water of Marah and placed it into her bag. After they had rested a little while, she was able to resume the journey, and for a time was much stronger that although the way that was steeper than before, she was not nearly so faint and exhausted. This greatly comforted her, for by that time she had only one desire in her heart, to reach the place appointed and fulfill the command which she had been given before her strength ebbed away from her. On the third day they lifted up their eyes and saw the place afar off, the great rock cliff and the waterfall, and continuing up the rocky path at midday, they came through the shrouding mist of the place which had been appointed. Chapter 16. Grave on the Mountains. The path led forward to the edge of a yawning chasm, then stopped dead. This grave-like gorge yawned before them in every direction as far as they could see, completely cutting off all further progress. It was so filled with cloud and mist that they could not see how deep it was, nor could they see across to the other side, but spread before them like a great gaping grave waiting to swallow them up. For a moment, Much Afraid wondered whether this could be the place, after all, but as they halted on the edge of the canyon, plainly they they could plainly hear the sound of mighty swirling waters, and she realized that they must be standing somewhere near the lip of the great fall, and that this was indeed the place appointed. Looking at her companions, she asked quietly, "What must we do now? Can we jump across to the other side?" "No," they said, "it would be impossible." "What then are we to do?" she asked. "We must leap down into the canyon," was the answer. "Of course," said Much Afraid at once. "I did not realize at first, but this is the thing to do." Then, for the first time on that journey, though she did not know it at the time, she held out her hand to her two companions that they might help her. By this time she was so weak and exhausted that instead of taking her hands, they came close up to her and put their hands beneath her arms so that she leaned her full weight against them. Thus, with suffering and sorrow supporting her, Much Afraid cast herself down into the yawning grave. The place unto which they had thrown themselves was deep, and had she been alone, she must have been badly hurt by the fall. However, her companions were so strong that the jump did not seem to harm them at all, and they bore her so easily between them and broke the fall so gently that she was no more than bruised and shaken. Then, because the canyon was so filled with mist and cloud that nothing was visible, they began to feel their way slowly forward, and saw looming up before them a flat, oblong rock. On reaching it, they found it to be some kind of stone altar with the indistinct figure of someone standing behind it. "This is the place," said Much Afraid quietly. "This is the place where I am to make my offering." She went up to the altar and knelt down. "My lord," she said softly through the mist, "will you come to me now and help me to make my burnt offering as you have commanded me?" But for the first time on all the journey, there seemed to be no answer at all, and the shepherd did not come. She knelt there quite alone in the cold, clammy mist, beside the desolate altar in this valley of shadow, and into her mind came the words which bitterness had flung at her before when she walked the shores of loneliness. Sooner or later, when he gets you up to the wild places of the mountains, he will put you on some sort of a cross and abandon you to it. It seemed that in a way bitterness had been right, thought Much Afraid to herself, only he had been too ignorant to know and too foolish at that time to understand that in all the world only one thing really mattered: to do the will of the one she followed, and lo and that she followed and loved, no matter what it involved or cost. Strangely enough, as she knelt there by the altar, seemingly abandoned at the last tremendous crisis, there was no sign or sound of the presence of her enemies. The grave upon the mountain is at the very edge of the high places and beyond the reach of pride and bitterness and resentment and self pity, yes, and of fear too, as though she were in a strange world altogether, for they can never cast themselves down into the grave. She knelt there, feeling neither despair nor hope. She knew now, without a shadow of a doubt, that there would be no angel to call from heaven to say that the sacrifice need not be made, and that this knowledge caused her neither dread nor shrinking. She felt nothing but a great stillness in which only one desire remained: to do that which he had told her, simply because simply because he had asked it of her. The cold, dull desolation which had filled her heart in the cave was gone completely. One flame burned there steadily, the flame of concentrated desire to do his will. Everything else had died down and fallen into ashes. After she had waited for a little while, and still he had not come, she put out her hand and with one final effort of failing strength grasped the natural human love and desire growing in her heart, and struggled to tear them out. At the first touch, it was as though anguish pierced through her every nerve and fiber, and she knew with a pang of with a pang almost of despair, that the roots had wound and twined and thrust themselves into every part of her being. Though she put forth all her remaining strength in the most desperate effort to wrench them out, not a single root stirred. For the first time, she felt something akin to fear and panic. She was not able to do this thing which he had asked of her. Having reached the altar at last, she was powerless to obey. Turning to those who had been her guides and helpers all the way up the mountain, all the way up the mountains, she asked them for their help, and for them to do what she could not do herself, to tear the plant out of her heart. For the first time, suffering and sorrow shook their heads. "We have done all that we can for you," they answered, "but this we cannot do." At that, the indistinct figure behind the altar stepped forward and said gently, "I am the priest of this altar. I will take it out of your heart if you wish." Much Afraid turned toward him instantly. "Oh, thank you," she said. "I beg you to do so." He came and stood beside her, his form indistinct and blurred by the mist, and then she continued, entreatingly, "I am a very great coward. I am afraid of the pain. I am afraid that the pain may I'm sorry. I am afraid that the pain may cause me to resist you. Will you bind me to the altar in some way, so that I cannot move. I would not like to be found struggling while the will of the Lord is done. There was complete silence in the cloud filled canyon for a moment or two. Then the priest answered, "It is well. I will bind you to the altar." Then he bound her hand and foot. When he had finished, much afraid, lifted her face toward the high places, which were quite invisible, and spoke quietly through the mist. "My Lord, behold me. Here I am in the place thou didst send me, doing the thing thou didst tell me to do. For where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me." Still there was silence, a silence as of the grave, for indeed she was in the grave of her own hopes, and still without the promised Hinds' feet, still outside of the high places, with even the promise to be laid down on the altar. This was the place to which she this was the place to which her long heartbreaking journey had led her. Yet just once more before she laid it down on the altar, much afraid repeated the glorious promise which had been the cause of her starting for the high places. "The Lord God is my strength, and he will make my feet like hinds' feet, and he will make me to walk upon my high places." To the chief singer on my stringed instruments. The priest put forth a hand of steel right under her heart. There was a sound of rending and tearing, and the human love, with all its myriad rootlets and fibers, came forth. He held it for a moment, and then said, "Yes, it was ripe for removal. The time had come. There is not a rootlet torn or missing." When he had said this, he cast it down on the altar and spread his hands above it. There came a flash of fire which seemed to rend the altar. After that, nothing but ashes remained, either of the love itself, which had been so deeply planted in her heart, or the suffering and sorrow which had been her companions on that long, strange journey. A sense of utter, overwhelming rest and peace engulfed Much Afraid. At last the offering had been made, and there was nothing left to be done. When the priest had unbound her, and she leaned forward over the ashes on the altar and said, with complete thanksgiving, "It is finished," then, utterly exhausted, she fell asleep.